Hello, and welcome to an introduction to the 6 phases of health impact assessment. You're watching the 4th video in the HIA 101 series. This video introduces the 6 phases of HIA used in the American practice. They are screening, scoping, assessment, reporting, evaluation, and monitoring. The number of phases involved in HIA varies in the literature from 5 to 10. There are 6 phases used in American practice as advocated by the Centers for Disease Control and Protection and outlined in the minimum standards of HIA practice. It is important to remember that although they are in order in this diagram, HIA is an iterative process. Just because one has gone through the scoping phase, for instance, doesn't mean you don't go back and reevaluate your assumptions and predictions as more information becomes available throughout the HIA process. Screening is the first phase. The purpose of screening is, according to Bhatia, to assess the value, feasibility, and utility of the HIA in the decision-making process. In this phase, we ask the following questions. What is the decision to be informed and who is making the decision? Is health being considered already? Is it feasible to complete the HIA? Do you have time? Do you have the right people? Do you have the right resources? Will an HIA be politically viable? Are politicians or decision makers open to receiving recommendations on the decision? Will the HIA add value to the decision-making process? And what are the health issues involved? If you determine that it's feasible to move ahead given the time, people, and funding you have available, you would next move to the scoping phase. In scoping, you create your scope, objectives, and approach. This is your roadmap to the process. It tells you who will be responsible for each task, what the deliverables are, and when they are due. You may have to narrow your scope by geography or study area, demography or identifying affected groups, and the number of health outcomes you can study. Your limits will depend upon the resources available to you in terms of personnel, time, and valid data sources. You will also need to choose the type of HIA you perform: desktop, rapid, intermediate, or comprehensive. The scoping phase is when the goals, timelines, and work plans are developed. Stakeholders are identified and the stakeholder engagement strategies are planned. The process evaluation criteria is set and the available data is evaluated. Once you have determined the parameters of your HIA, you will need to formulate a methodology to predict the health impacts and develop recommendations. The assessment phase is where the baseline environmental and health conditions are gathered and a methodology is employed to predict health effects, their severity, and duration. The data gathered and the information produced in the assessment phase create the evidence base for making recommendations. Recommendations are made to enhance any positive health outcomes associated with the decision and to mitigate or contain any negative health impacts. These are usually collated into a report about the HIA, the process, the stakeholders engaged, and the expected outcomes. Reporting is the phase in which your communications plan is implemented. Ideally, the results of the HIA and recommendations are reported to the stakeholder groups and refined before being presented to decision makers. The purpose is to gut check the recommendations with the community and to create buy-in and support for the recommendations. Once all input from stakeholders has been incorporated, the final HIA report is prepared and presented to stakeholders. This can take many forms. It could be a formal technical HIA report, an executive summary outlining the recommendations, a one-page fact sheet about the HIA and its outcomes, or even a PowerPoint presentation. There is no one way to communicate these findings. Different methods should be employed that best suit that audience. Once recommendations have been reported to decision makers, the next phase is to evaluate your process, outcomes, and impact. The last 2 phases of HIA, evaluation and monitoring, are usually done after the fact. Evaluation at this point in practice is primarily process evaluation, meaning you look at the way you conducted the HIA and test for effectiveness. The primary questions in a process evaluation are: did you meet the goals you set out at the beginning of the HIA? Was the process clear to everyone involved? Were the right people involved? Was your community engagement process effective at soliciting feedback from affected residents? Did residents feel that their participation was valued and mattered? Did you use the best evidence and data available upon which to base your recommendations? And what percentage of your recommendations were adopted? The other two kinds of evaluation are outcome and impact evaluation. Outcome evaluation is concerned with the outcomes predicted by the HIA and measures changes in public health status and health determinants as the decision is implemented. Impact evaluation is broader and looks at the long-term impacts on public health stemming from the HIA, such as partnerships formed, intensified, or formalized, the institutionalization of HIA into decision-making processes, or changes in policy or law resulting from the HIA. Monitoring happens after the recommendations have been accepted or rejected and the policy plan or project has been implemented. Monitoring refers to the process of observing changes over time and the health indicators used to predict impacts. In this phase, you are watching to see if you correctly predicted the health impacts and what their distribution and severity are. In most cases, the monitoring phase is not carried out because HIA funding does not cover it. However, many teams are now beginning to create a monitoring plan as part of the HIA and assign different partners to report periodically on the progress. Others have created web-based dashboards to report back to their communities on a regular basis. Monitoring has traditionally been very funding dependent, but the advent of big data is making it easier and less expensive. HIA, as practiced in the U.S., has 6 phases which are iterative in nature. As the team moves through the phases, more and more information is known and uncertainty is reduced. As more and more information is known, assumptions and limitations of the HIA will change and will need to be reconsidered. Each of the 6 phases can be evaluated and examined for effectiveness and rigor. As more and more HIAs are conducted, impact and outcome metrics will become more common, as will funding for long-term monitoring and the predicted impacts. Tune into our next video for a more detailed description of each phase. Thank you.